Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The night air was thick with anticipation, charged by the electricity of an impending storm that threatened the peace of the English countryside. Eldritch Manor, with its ancient stone and sprawling terraces, stood silent against the tumult of nature. Hidden behind a veil of rain and swirling fog, the grand estate awaited its guests, each one drawn to this secluded haven by promises not entirely made in the sunshine of clear days. Madame Mirage, shrouded in a cloak of midnight blue, was the first to arrive. Her carriage pulled up with a crunch on the wet gravel, horses snorting as they fought the pull of the wind. As she stepped down, her eyes captured the flash of lightning, reflecting an insight beyond the mere play of light. Her reputation as an illusionist was built on such mysteries, each act a maze of wonder and deception. Not far behind was the Countess of Wexley, a woman whose bearing spoke of old money and ancient lineage, even as her fortunes waned like the waning moon above. Her vehicle, more modest than her title suggested, came to a halt with an elegance born of practice. She adjusted the emerald brooch at her neck, a glimmering heirloom, and proceeded toward the manor's great oak doors, which opened as if by some unseen hand. The next arrival was Mr. Harold Gravestone, whose name was as hard and cold as the industries he controlled. His automobile, a latest model with gleaming fixtures, roared louder than the storm's cacophony as it approached. His face, when he emerged, was set in determination. Eldritch Manor to him was a chessboard, and tonight he was poised to make a decisive move. Close on his heels, under an umbrella that did little to shield her from the whims of the wind, came Seraphina, the medium whose fame whispered through society's parlours like a ghostly breeze. Her eyes, deep pools of sorrow and wisdom, seemed to pierce through the shroud of rain as she approached the threshold of the manor. The host, Alistair Crowley, was a man of peculiar habits and secretive inclinations, who preferred the solitude of his expansive home to the bustling streets of London. He watched from a shadowed window as his guests arrived, each carrying secrets as heavy as the storm clouds overhead. Inside, the manor was a labyrinth of opulence and history, its hallways lined with portraits of stern ancestors and landscapes of forgotten battles. The flicker of candles cast a warm glow against the wood-panelled walls, battling the cold draught that danced through the corridors. As the clock struck 7, thunder rolled across the heavens, sealing the manor off from the world like a tomb. The guests found themselves in the grand drawing-room, exchanging pleasantries over the clink of crystal and the crackle of the fireplace. Yet, beneath the polite chatter, a palpable tension simmered, a mix of curiosity and caution. Crowley, raising his glass for a toast, seemed almost too pleased with the assembly. "To a night of revelations," he proclaimed, his voice barely rising above the storm's howl. The guests toasted in response, though the flicker in their eyes spoke of unease. Dinner was served in the grand dining hall under the watch of oil paintings and tapestries that told tales of Eldritch Manor's storied past. The table was set with gleaming silver and fine china, the food a gourmet offering despite the isolation imposed by the weather. Conversation ebbed and flowed like the rain against the pane, topics ranging from the mundane to the mysterious. Madame Mirage was particularly animated, her stories of illusion and performances drawing sceptical looks from Inspector Archibald Price, who had joined the party by a curious turn of fate, his arrival timed almost too perfectly with the crescendo of the storm. His reputation as a man of logic and reason was well known, and his sceptical gaze often lingered longer on the speakers. Seraphina, ever the enigma, spoke little, her comments veiled in ambiguity and shadows, her eyes occasionally meeting Crowley's with a spark of undisclosed knowledge. The Countess, meanwhile, engaged Mr. Gravestone in discussions of artifacts and antiquities, her interest particularly piqued by tales of the manor's hidden treasures. As dessert was served, a confection as dark as the secrets it sweetened, the lights flickered, a testament to the storm's growing fury. It was then, in that flickering uncertainty, that Crowley proposed a tour of his private collection, housed within the depths of Eldritch, where shadows reigned supreme. The guests consented, curiosity piqued by the promise of viewing Crowley's prized artifacts, pieces shrouded in as much mystery as their collector. They did not know, as they filed out of the dining hall, that this night would unravel yarns not just of silk and gold, but of deceit, desire, and death. As the manor's doors closed behind them, sealing their fates within stone walls and stormy whispers, the game was set, a game of shadows and secrets, where every player harbored a motive for far more than mere observation. Chapter 2. A Mysterious Death. The party guests huddled in the dimly lit drawing room, their faces painted with faint shadows and unease. In the midst of this sombre gathering, the manor's master, Charles Crowley, was notably absent. His absence grew more conspicuous as the evening waned, and whispering speculations amongst the guests filled the void of his presence. It was Madame Mirage who first expressed concern, her voice a soft melodious timbre that cut through the murmurs. "It is unlike our host to forsake his guests so," she remarked, glancing around with her entrancingly keen eyes. The Countess of Wexley nodded in agreement, her elegant fingers nervously fidgeting with the pearls at her neck. The industrialist, Mr. Harold Gravestone, a man with a countenance as hard as the empire he had built, scoffed lightly. Crowley always did fancy himself a bit of an enigma. Perhaps this is merely his notion of a parlour game, leaving us to our devices while he lurks about. Seraphina, ever the medium of otherworldly charm and mystery, tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "I sense a disturbance deeper than our host's penchant for theatrics," she said, her voice quivering with a hint of foreboding. The concern, now palpable, prompted them to action. Led by the robust figure of Gravestone, they decided to seek out their host. Through the labyrinthine corridors of the manor, with its Gothic arches and ancestral armour suits standing sentinel, they moved, a spectral procession guided only by the intermittent lightning that flickered through the stained glass windows. Reaching the heavy oak door of Crowley's study, Gravestone knocked with a firmness that matched his disposition. The silence that greeted them was as chilling as the grave. After a series of unanswered calls and knocks, an increasing trepidation took hold, leading Gravestone to shoulder the door with considerable force and broke in the door. Charles Crowley was found seated behind his grand mahogany desk, an eternal stillness about him. A candle, nearly spent, cast a quivering light upon his features, distorted in an expression of profound surprise and horror. The room, usually a sanctuary of intellectual pursuit and esoteric artifacts, bore an air of chaotic intrusion. Drawings were scattered like fallen leaves in autumn, and books lay open as if their secrets were desperately sought in a final moment. The artifact, a fabled antiquity whose origins were steeped in the mystic lore of ancient civilizations, was conspicuously absent from the iron-clad safe that now hung open, like the maw of some great beast. The grim tableau prompted an immediate summons for Inspector Archibald Price, a man whose reputation for unravelling the most intricate of mysteries was known well beyond the local constabulary. His arrival was prefigured by an anonymous letter, slide-creased and cryptic, warning him of dire events at Eldritch Manor. The contents had been succinct. "Chaos looms where shadows reign. Seek the light at Eldritch Manor before night claims its due." Price, upon entering the gloomy study, exhibited neither surprise nor fear. His gaze, sharp and assessing, swept over the room with the methodical precision of a chess master contemplating the board. "It appears," he began, his voice steady and authoritative, "that we are dealing with a matter most foul and convoluted. Mr. Crowley's untimely demise and the artifact's disappearance suggest a game of high stakes and deep shadows." Madame Mirage's fluttering lashes did little to veil her quick interest. The Countess, regal still even in the face of death, clasped her hands before her, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. Gravestone's jaw was set, his mind clearly racing through the implications of the night's events on his ventures. Seraphina, standing slightly apart, seemed to communicate with unseen spirits, her lips moving in silent discourse. Inspector Price, observing each in turn, knew the unravelling of this enigma would challenge the very boundaries of his rational mind. Yet he was undaunted. With a nod toward the body, he declared, "We shall begin by understanding the last moments of Mr. Crowley's life, and how each of you fits into this intricate puzzle." Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Inspector Archibald Price marched through the oppressive silence that had settled over Eldritch Manor like a thick shroud. A lantern clutched in his hand cast grotesque shadows upon the walls, the light flickering against the portraits of long-deceased Crowleys who seemed to watch with silent accusation. In the grand drawing-room, suffused with the scent of beeswax and lingering perfume, the four guests awaited, ensconced in an atmosphere dense with suspicion. Each displayed a facade expertly crafted to conceal the churning depths of their own concerns, a veritable masquerade ball of motives. Price cleared his throat, a signal that sliced through the room's tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I believe you understand the gravity of the situation. Mr. Charles Crowley, your host and my old acquaintance, has been found dead under circumstances most peculiar, and a valuable artifact is missing. I shall require your full cooperation." Madame Mirage, draped in a shawl that shimmered like the surface of a disturbed pond, inclined her head, her eyes veiled beneath thick lashes. The Countess of Wexley, regal even in distress, nodded curtly, her fingers tightening around the clasp of her handbag. Mr. Harold Gravestone, his brow furrowed, gave a grunt that might have been agreement. Seraphina, the medium whose fame and mystery twisted around her like the ivy on the manor's old walls, simply smiled, an enigma unto herself. Price decided to begin with Madame Mirage, whose performances of illusion had charmed the courts of Europe. "Madame Mirage," he started, feeling the weight of his notebook in his pocket. "Could you recount your whereabouts when the storm began?" "It was an emphatic tempest, was it not, Inspector?" she replied, voice tinged with an accent that hinted at distant shores. "I was preparing in my room. The elements do provide a dramatic backdrop for one's entrance, don't they?" "And did anyone vouch for your presence there?" Price probed, watching closely. "Afraid not, Inspector. But you see, a lady values her privacy highly," she answered with a half-smile. Next, the Countess's sharp gaze met his. "Countess, given your well-reputed scholarship in artifacts, you perhaps had a keen interest in Mr. Crowley's collection." Her response was measured, precise. "Indeed, Inspector, my interest is purely academic. Alistair and I often discussed history at great length, but I assure you, my last encounter with him was in the context of a debate over the Byzantine Empire's trade routes." Gravestone's statement was tinged with impatience. "I was in the library, examining some of Crowley's manuscripts. We had potential business ventures planned, and I sought to better understand the man's mind." "And Seraphina?" Price turned lastly to the medium, whose calm demeanour remained unperturbed. "Inspector, I was walking the gardens, communing with the lingering spirits there. The dead speak louder during storms, you know." Price scribbled notes before lining his next questions. Was anyone aware that Mr. Crowley possessed this artifact of great value? "It was no secret he boasted about it when the mood took him," said Gravestone, with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "The same artifact," continued Price, "that is believed to grant immense power to its holder." Madame Mirage laughed softly, a sound like tinkling glass. "Superstitions, Inspector. We thrive on them, do we not?" "Yes, but sometimes, Madame, superstition and reality collide with dire consequences," Price said sharply. With one last sweeping glance at the suspects, Inspector Price concluded the evening's interrogations. "Thank you for your cooperation. Rest assured, we will speak again. For now, I urge you to remain within the manor." His rational mind wrestled with the threads of mysticism that wove through the heart of this mystery, knowing full well that within the manor's walls, truth and illusion were entangled like the thorny vines that clung to its ancient stones. In the quiet of his temporary quarters, Inspector Price thought of who might have the motive to kill Charles Crowley. Chapter 4. Shadows and Whispers. Inside the manor, the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation and an undercurrent of fear as Seraphina, clad in a flowing gown of deep violet that appeared almost black in the dim light, prepared to conduct her séance. The guests, wrapped in their own apprehensions, were gathered around a large oaken table that had been cleared and set with a circle of candles, their flames flickering as if in dance with the shadows. Inspector Archibald Price, his eyes narrowed in skepticism, observed each participant as they took their seats. Despite his rational mind, he couldn't wholly dismiss the trembling hands or the pallor that had overtaken some of their faces. There was Madame Mirage, her face an unreadable mask, Mr. Harold Gravestone, whose eyes darted nervously, and the Countess of Wexley, who maintained a composed but clearly forced indifference. Seraphina raised her hands, her voice resonating softly, yet carrying an eerie power as she began to speak. "Spirits of Eldritch Manor, we beseech you, come forth and reveal the truths that lurk in the shadows of this place." Her words seemed to mingle with the wind, giving them a corporeal force that seemed to make the very air heavy. Price watched, the way the candlelight played against the walls, the nervous shifts of the seated participants, the low murmuring of the wind, which almost sounded like whispered voices. As Seraphina's incantations grew more intense, a palpable tension settled over the room. Suddenly, the candles flared as if caught in a sudden breeze, and the temperature dropped perceptibly. A collective gasp rose from the table, and even Price felt a chill that he attributed to a draught, though no windows were open. "Who dares disturb my rest?" The voice, unlike Seraphina's, boomed from nowhere, and yet from everywhere, deep and resonant. Price's eyes darted around, searching for the source, aware of the tricks that could be played with ventriloquism and acoustics. "It is I, Seraphina, conduit to the living," the medium replied, her own voice now trembling either with feigned fear or genuine terror. Price couldn't decide which. "Why do you summon me?" "We seek knowledge about the death of Charles Crowley and the whereabouts of a powerful artifact," she said. The inspector noted the subtle shift in Madame Mirage's expression, a flicker of something that might have been alarm. "The artifact, it is cursed. Darkness, betrayal," the spirit voice boomed again. "Who among us is the betrayer?" Seraphina's voice wavered with the weight of her question. There was a lengthy pause, so prolonged that Price felt each second stretch into an eternity. Then the voice, filled with a sorrow that chilled to the bone, answered, "The one who seeks to gain the most, the one draped in deceit." The candles snuffed out in unison, plunging the room into darkness. Screams pierced the air, chairs scraped back hastily, and when the lights abruptly returned, Seraphina sat slumped, her face ashen, as if the very life had been drained from her. The guests were in disarray, their fear palpable and contagious, with accusations now whispered fervently among them. Price, however, remained outwardly calm, though his mind raced. The séance, theatrical as it was, had unearthed raw, genuine fear, and perhaps some truth hidden within the well-crafted performance. Madame Mirage was the first to recover her composure. "A parlor trick designed to frighten and manipulate," she declared, her gaze sweeping over the guests with a knowing look. But her words, intended to soothe, seemed only to stoke the fires of suspicion among the others. Price pulled Seraphina aside as the others engaged in hushed, frantic conversation. "You play a dangerous game," he whispered sternly. "What truth lies beneath this performance?" Seraphina met his gaze, her earlier vulnerability replaced by a sharp, defensive edge. "You of all people should know, Inspector, sometimes the greatest truths are those cloaked in the greatest spectacles." Price pondered her words, aware of the layers of deception that tangled like the ivy on the manor's old walls. Chapter 5. Clues from the Past. Inspector Archibald Price's lantern cast eerie shadows as he delved deeper into the private quarters of the late Charles Crowley. Amid the labyrinthine layout of the mansion, Price discovered a secluded study, untouched, it seemed, by the passage of regular domestic life. Here, the past owners had left their imprint not just in the dust, but through numerous documents and personal effects that lay scattered across the room. The study was a treasure trove of history. Bookshelves lined the walls, stuffed with leather-bound volumes and manuscripts, interspersed with curious artifacts that must have caught the fancy of many a collector. A massive oak desk stood as the room's centerpiece, its surface littered with papers, maps, and a conspicuously large, aged journal bound in red leather. Price approached the desk with a detective's caution, his hands covered with fine gloves to avoid damaging the potential evidence. He flipped open the heavy cover of the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with sprawling handwriting that told of Crowley's ancestors, their dealings, and perhaps most crucially, their rivalries and alliances that were as alive today as they had been centuries ago. The inspector was struck by an entry dated some 50 years prior, detailing a feud between the Crowleys and another prominent family, the Blackwoods, who accused the Crowleys of having stolen a prized occult artifact. This artifact, it appeared, was none other than the one recently purloined from within these very walls. The entry spoke of curses and revenge, elements that seemed to have transcended the boundary of superstition to manifest in tangible hostility. Price's brow furrowed as he read on, the gentle hum of the storm outside a stark contrast to the racing of his mind. Could the historical enmity detailed in these pages provide a motive for murder? Was it possible that descendants of the Blackwood family were among the guests cloaked in different identities? Amid these ponderings, a loose page tucked between the entries caught his attention. It was a letter, penned in a different hand, stark against the flowing cursive of the journal entries. The letter was addressed to Charles Crowley from a certain Evie Blackwood. It spoke of reconciliation and a proposition to end the feud for the mutual benefit of both families. Curiously, the letter mentioned a demonstration of good faith, the return of the stolen artifact which was to take place on the very night of Crowley's death. Price felt the edges of the puzzle beginning to gnaw at his rational mind. This was no mere coincidence. The artifact's disappearance might well be the linchpin in a century-old conflict, its significance far exceeding monetary value, tapping into deep-seated beliefs and vendettas. Closing the journal with care, Price returned it to its place and continued his search through the room. In a small locked drawer, opened with a pick from his pocket, he found more letters and what appeared to be diary entries from different members of the Crowley family. These writings confirmed his suspicions. The artifact was central, not only to Charles Crowley's demise, but also to the history and future of Eldritch Manor itself. Each document, each piece of correspondence Price excavated from that dusty room, constructed a narrative rich with intrigue, betrayal, and a hunger for power. With his evidence in hand, Inspector Price knew that the coming interrogations would need to be delicately handled. The guests harbored secrets, motives intertwined with the history of the manor, each waiting to be untangled. Chapter 6: Illusions and Deceptions. The grand hall of Eldritch Manor, once a place of opulent gatherings, had transformed into a stage for the bizarre and the uncanny. Amidst the dim candlelight, the shadowy figures gathered, their features drawn with anticipation and apprehension. With a flourish of her velvet cape, Madame Mirage stepped into the centre of the hall. Her eyes, dark as the storm clouds above, scanned her audience with an enigmatic smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice resonated with an almost hypnotic quality, "prepare yourselves to witness illusions that will challenge the very fabric of your reality." Inspector Archibald Price, his keen eyes missing nothing, stood apart from the others. He regarded Madame Mirage with a mixture of skepticism and professional curiosity. As an officer of the law dedicated to the rational and the explainable, he found the illusionist's promise of bending reality a direct challenge to his methodical mind. The first of her performances began innocuously. A series of card tricks, masterful yet expected, served to draw the guests into her web of charm. Laughter and light applause filled the hall as she restored a torn card to whole, plucked the very card a guest had thought of from the deck. But as the night marched towards its darkest hour, her tricks grew increasingly complex and disturbing. With a dramatic wave of her hands, the candle lights flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp rose from the group, a sound swallowed up by the howling wind. When the candles stuttered back to life, Madame Mirage was nowhere to be seen. A moment of panicked silence ensued until her laughter, chilling and disembodied, echoed from the walls. "Look above!" she commanded. All eyes turned upward. Madame Mirage was suspended from the chandelier, her body twirling slowly, a macabre marionette. With another laugh, she vanished only to reappear instantaneously at the far end of the hall, as though she had traversed the space by mere thought. Inspector Price, his brow furrowed, scribbled a note in his small, worn notebook. Each trick, each illusion, while captivating, seemed to him a calculated distraction. What was the purpose? To awe, to bemuse, or perhaps to deceive? As the final act approached, tension threaded through the air, thick as the velvet curtains that draped the walls. Madame Mirage invited Seraphina, the medium, to join her. Together, they performed what they termed the phantasmagoria. Shadows danced on the walls, growing larger and then shrinking, as though alive. Voices, eerie and whispering, filled the room, speaking in languages old as the Manor itself. Inspector Price moved quietly through the crowd, observing reactions, noting the keenest observers and those who shied away. The medium and the illusionist exchanged surreptitious glances that did not go unnoticed by his trained eye. With a crash that shook the room, the illusion culminated in the spectral image of Charles Crowley himself, seemingly stepping from the beyond, pointing a solemn finger at the gathered crowd before dissipating into mist. Silence reigned until Madame Mirage stepped forward, her voice steady. Let no one claim that the boundaries of reality cannot be challenged, nor that the past cannot make itself known to the present. Applause broke out, though tentative and tinged with fear. Inspector Price, however, did not join in. His mind was alive with questions and theories. The performance, while undeniably impressive, was to him as transparent as the apparitions that had capered about the hall. It was all a meticulously crafted distraction, from what he was yet to determine. As the guests discussed the eerie spectacle, Price approached Madame Mirage, who regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Your talent for the theatrical is unparalleled, Madame," Price commented dryly, "but I must inquire, what is it exactly that you aim to obscure with these displays?" Madame Mirage's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Inspector, sometimes we must distract the eye to reveal the truth. You of all people should understand that." Chapter 7. Unveiling Motives. Despite the thrumming rain that pelted the ancient glass of Eldritch Manor's expansive drawing room, the fire therein crackled with an inviting warmth, casting dancing shadows upon the walls, lined with sombre portraits of long-deceased Crowleys. Inspector Archibald Price, his gaze fixed on the imposing figure of Mr. Harold Gravestone, who stood with his back rigid. "Mr. Gravestone," began Price, his voice a calm counterpoint to the howl of the tempest outside, "your financial records, which I had the opportunity to review with the aid of the local constabulary, suggest your empire is teetering on the brink. Would this dire strait motivate you to commit theft, or perhaps something even more drastic?" Harold Gravestone, his countenance usually so controlled, now twitched with an undeniable strain. His eyes, dark and fathomless, flickered towards the door, as if contemplating escape, but he answered, "My affairs are my own, Inspector. The artifact's supposed powers were of academic interest to me, nothing more." "And yet," Price pressed on, One could surmise that a man in your position might find particular interest in an artifact believed to influence fortunes. Could not such a relic save your crumbling empire? A fire sparked behind Gravestone's eyes, a mix of indignation and fear. You presume much, Inspector, but as I said, my interest was purely academic. Before more could be said, the room's second occupant, the enigmatic Countess of Wexley, interjected with a smooth, silvery tone that belied the tension in the air. Come now, Mr. Gravestone, the inspector is merely doing his duty. We all have our secrets, don't we? Her words were silk, but her gaze was steel. Price turned his attention towards her, noting the calculated nonchalance of her posture against the brocade-covered settee. Her hands, draped elegantly across her lap, were still but for a slight tremor in her fingers, a detail not unnoticed by the inspector. Indeed we do, Countess, Price acknowledged, then added. Your own interest in the occult and ancient artifacts is well documented. A collection enviable by any standard, yet notably missing a piece as rare as the Crowley artifact. The Countess smiled, a tight, controlled curvature of her lips. An oversight I would have dearly liked to rectify, Inspector. However, I assure you, my collection, extensive though it may be, is not built on theft. And murder? Price's question hung in the air like the smoke from his pipe, thick and insinuating. That is a line I do not cross, she returned smoothly, her eyes cold. I prefer to acquire my treasures through less sordid means. The inspector's piercing gaze shifted from the Countess back to Gravestone. Both suspects held their composure, yet the air was thick with unspoken admissions. As it stands, Price finally continued, both of you had the motive to covet the artifact. Mr. Gravestone, for the power it could wield over your financial calamities. Countess, for the rarity and possible capabilities such an item would add to your collection. Yet, without further evidence... He let the statement dangle, unfinished, watching as both his subjects absorbed the implication. The inspector knew well the art of psychological warfare in interrogation. Sometimes the unspoken could stir more than direct accusation. As the storm outside began to wane, its fury spent, the echoes of the manor seemed to grow louder, the secrets it housed straining against the silence. Inspector Archibald Price knew this was merely the eye of the storm. The true tempest, hidden within the walls of Eldritch Manor, was yet to fully reveal itself. Chapter 8. The Medium's Play. As Inspector Archibald Price made his way down the dim, creaking corridors of Eldritch Manor, he noticed how its vast rooms and secret passageways had become not just a scene of a crime, but a living participant in the night's dark drama. It was in the shadow-laden drawing-room that Price observed a peculiar interaction. Madame Mirage, the illusionist known for her captivating performances, was conversing in hushed, urgent tones with Seraphina, the medium whose reputation for contacting the dead chilled even the hardiest of souls. Their heads were close together, and every so often they glanced around, eyes flickering with a mix of fear and determination. Price, his curiosity now significantly piqued, managed to move closer under the guise of examining a nearby portrait. The words he caught were fragmented, shards of a dangerous plot crystallizing in veiled language. "Not here. Too risky," Seraphina whispered, her eyes darting nervously. Madame Mirage responded, a steel edge to her low, controlled voice. "We can't delay. The artifact's power is not something we can squander. The syndicate won't tolerate failure." Inspector Price stepped into the light, his sudden appearance startling them. "Madame, Miss Seraphina," he greeted with deceptive calm, "perhaps you can assist me further in understanding tonight's tragic events." The women exchanged a fleeting look of panic, quickly masked by a plastered calmness that might have fooled a lesser detective. Madame Mirage, ever the performer, recovered first. "Inspector, we were merely discussing the unfortunate atmosphere tonight's tragic discovery has cast upon us all." I appreciate the sentiment, Price replied, eyeing them both with a steady, analytical gaze. However, it's the nature of your discussion about the syndicate and the artifact that intrigues me more. Perhaps you'd be kind enough to elaborate. Seraphina, a figure ethereal in her flowing robes, seemed momentarily to falter, her fingers twisting nervously in the fabric of her dress. It was Madame Mirage who spoke, her tone a carefully modulated blend of candour and caution. Inspector, in times of distress, people often speak of many things. Our conversation was nothing more than a speculative discussion on the artifact's purported powers. And is it the powers of the artifact that the syndicate is interested in, or is it something more tangible? Price pressed, his gaze unwavering. Madame Mirage hesitated, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly, before she replied, "What syndicate, Inspector? We are artists and entertainers. Our interest in the artifact is purely from a scholarly, perhaps mystical point of view." Yet words like power and not squandering suggest a more practical application, Price countered smoothly, watching as Seraphina seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of his scrutiny. Seraphina finally spoke, her voice a mere wisp in the cavernous room. "We may have been overzealous in our expressions. The night, the storm, it all creates shadows even in the brightest of minds." Price nodded, but his eyes did not leave theirs. "Of course, the shadows of the mind are often where truth hides. Now tell me, are you searching for the artifact to shield it from misuse, or to use it yourselves?" At this, Madame Mirage straightened, her demeanour morphing into one of cool detachment. "Inspector, your reputation for thoroughness is well known. It is true that we have interests beyond what might be considered customary, but believe us when we say we do not have the artifact. Our associates believed it could be hidden here, under the very nose of Mr. Crowley. The chaunts, the illusions, all intended to distract, to give us time to search." "A search that has so far yielded nothing," Price concluded, his mind whirring with the implications of their admission. "Exactly so," Madame Mirage affirmed, a trace of unease flickering across her composed features. Inspector Price paused, reflecting on their words. "Then we are all searching for the same thing, in different shadows and for different reasons." His tone was philosophical, almost musing. "I suggest you both remain available for further questioning. It would be unwise to leave the manor tonight." As he left them standing in the drawing room, their faces ghostly in the erratic candlelight, Price felt the edges of the puzzle beginning to form a clearer picture. Chapter 9. The Countess's Gambit. In the dimly lit ambience of Eldritch Manor's library, Inspector Archibald Price stood, scanning the labyrinth of dark oak and leather-bound volumes. The clue that had led him here was cryptic, nested in the folds of a discarded letter he had found tucked behind a dusty portrait of Mr. Crowley. The script was elegant, a stark contrast to its ominous message, which hinted at secrets ensconced within the library. As his fingers traced the spines of the books, a slight anomaly caught his attention. A volume slightly protruded from the rest. It was an aged edition of Dante's Inferno, a book seemingly innocuous, yet incongruent amidst treatises on ancient civilizations. Drawing it out with a meticulous care, Price was not surprised when a soft click echoed subtly through the room. The shelf before him gave way with a silent grace, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay the artifact, a small, unassuming object enveloped in velvet that seemed to pulse with an inner life. Before Price could extend his hand to unveil it fully, a voice broke the heavy silence. "I see you found it," said the Countess of Wexley, stepping into the halo of light cast by Price's candle. Her gaze held a mix of defiance and desperation. Price turned, his expression unreadable. "Indeed, Countess, but I presume there is more to this discovery than meets the eye." With a measured breath, the Countess stepped closer. "That artifact, Inspector, is the linchpin to restoring my family's fortune. It is imbued with properties that could revolutionize the world if fallen into the right hands. And murder? Was that necessary in your quest, Countess? Price's voice was almost disarming in its directness. The Countess paused, her features hardened by the shadows. Charles Crowley was no innocent inspector. He dabbled in affairs far beyond his comprehension. I did what was needed to preserve a greater future. Price nodded slowly, absorbing her confession with a disquieting placidity. And what of the other guests? Were they merely pawns in your elaborate scheme? They believed in the artifact's mysticism, she replied, her tone tinged with disdain. Such beliefs make people predictable and easily manipulated. It was not challenging to steer suspicion as I deemed fit. So, you orchestrated the illusion of supernatural involvement. With a bit of help, yes. Fear is a powerful ally, Inspector. Price considered her words, his mind dissecting each layer of deceit. And now, Countess? He asked, gesturing to the artifact. The Countess's eyes flashed, a mix of resolve and something akin to fear. Now, I must ask you to consider the potential, Inspector. We could partner in this, imagine the possibilities. But Price shook his head. My duty is to the law, Countess, regardless of the potential fortunes or revolutions at stake. With a sigh that seemed to surrender more than just her immediate ambition, the Countess of Wexley nodded. I suppose I knew it would come to this. I am ready to face the consequences of my actions. As Price moved to secure the artifact, he paused, reflecting on the night's revelation. He looked at the Countess, a woman ensnared by her own desires and designs, now caught in the inexorable march of justice. Let us go, Countess. The storm is breaking, and with the dawn, clarity shall return to Eldritch Manor. Together, they walked through the corridors of the manor. Chapter 10. Dawn of Understanding. As the first light of dawn broke, Inspector Archibald Price sat at the age-worn desk in the study of Eldritch Manor. The inkwell and pen set before him, relics of a bygone era, seemed almost an anachronism in the light of the truths uncovered throughout the tumultuous night. Price dipped the nib into black ink and began to etch his thoughts onto the crisp page of his journal, a ritual to organize his reflections and seal the conclusions of the case. Last evening, the facade of each guest had been meticulously crafted, a mask worn to conceal their true intentions. Yet, as with all human pretenses, cracks had formed under the pressure of the night's events, revealing the fragile human desires beneath. The Countess of Wexley, with her aristocratic poise, had unveiled herself not just as a collector of artifacts, but as a master manipulator who had orchestrated the murder of Charles Crowley to claim the ultimate prize. Price wrote of how the séance, presided over by Seraphina, had initially appeared to be a conduit to the spiritual world. However, it had instead been a clever ruse, part of the deceit designed to distract from the earthly machinations concerning the artifact. What Price once dismissed as mere parlour tricks had indeed been part of a grander scheme, each act of illusion by Madame Mirage, another thread in the web of diversion. In his writings, Price noted the peculiar irony of the situation. The very artifact that was believed to hold unimaginable powers had been nothing more than an artfully crafted decoy, a tool used by Crowley to expose the venality lurking within his circle of acquaintances. The real artifact, ingeniously embedded into the very structure of the Countess's walking stick, was a symbol of her cunning and resourcefulness. It served as a stark emblem of the age-old adage that the most effective deceptions are those that hide in plain sight. Concluding his entries, Price wrote how his case had challenged his skepticism of the supernatural, pushing him to acknowledge that while the paranormal might not exist, the belief in it could exert tangible effects on the minds and actions of people. With the final words inked onto the page, Price closed his journal, the soft thud echoing slightly in the quiet room. His duty here was concluded, the truths uncovered and documented. Stepping out into the crisp morning air, Price felt a renewing sense of purpose invigorate his senses. The world was replete with mysteries, some cloaked in the supernatural, others veiled in human deceit. As he walked away from the manor, Inspector Archibald Price was already mentally bracing himself for the next enigma that would inevitably come his way in the shadowy, unseen realms of human desires and fears.